As with its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was greatly anticipated, in no small part for how it would render and reimagine the various locations of the original game, and perhaps more so than the dystopian, homogeneous setting of Midgar that comprised the 2020 remake. The promise and prospect of traversable overworlds and disparate towns such as Kalm, Cosmo Canyon and Costa del Sol was a fascinating thing to consider that raised many questions and speculations about scale, scope and explorability compared to the pioneering 1997 title. So with that in mind, and fresh off the back of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I'm playing through for a second time, I want to take a moment to break down, in brief, the comparisons and the aesthetics between old and new settings, what technology has now offered the locations, and consider how the wonderfully painted pre-rendered stills from 1997 have been extracted and reinterpreted by today's Square team. So, jumping in chronologically with Kalm and our introduction to the Grasslands, Kalm was always going to be an interesting one to handle, I think, because for me it represents one of the important and recurring tropes of the Final Fantasy series, which I term as the first town, or the first town vibe. And it's something we see in the village of Dali in Final Fantasy IX, the village of Balam in Final Fantasy VIII, and so on. And it's basically a light-hearted and whimsical sort of environment that comes as the first significant rest stop and reward for completing the first dramatic mission or dungeon or indeed boss fight in a Final Fantasy game. And as I've discussed elsewhere, I think this nods back to Tolkien and the village of Bree, which is the first rest stop for our fellowship in The Lord of the Rings. Now, Kalm in the original game comprises just one pre-rendered painting, if I remember rightly, at least for the exterior of the town, and it has a slightly twilight feel with these purple-blue hues on the cobblestones and the rooftops. It has smoke billowing from the chimney stacks and so on, and overall it has a very traditional village feel with these wood-beamed Tudoresque buildings and architectures for the houses. And really, in the world of Final Fantasy VII, the distinguishing feature of Kalm comes mainly from the NPC dialogue, and it's this idea and this image of the place as one of the few locations that genuinely benefits from and positively advocates the power of Mako technology in the world of Gaia. And with respect to this in terms of the environment, the main inkling of Shinra's powering and influence of the town comes from a discreet but aesthetically jarring Mako tank in the top left corner of the pre-rendered backdrop. Turning to Kalm in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the hints to the reliance on Mako have been dialed up, particularly when we're exploring the rooftops and we can see these huge industrial pipes around the city and bits like that. And the twilight feel has also dissipated with the loss of the purple cobblestones, which have been switched out in favour of an overall more natural hue, these lighter, brighter stoneworks. And actually, compared to the original game, there's much more of a medieval, traditional fantasy sort of feel, since Rebirth's Kalm has predominantly stone buildings and these regal banners that drape from turrets and stuff like that, and spired towers. So instead of kind of Tudor rooftops and these exposed wood beam buildings, we have a very sort of knights and castles sort of feel. And I think one of the key features of the place is the surrounding fortified wall, which actually some NPCs do refer to, and it's a defining feature of the environment. And actually, I thought this was a new addition, and I hadn't really noticed it until reviewing the original painting of Kalm. But this does feature in the original game, in the pre-rendered backdrop. But owing to how close-cropped the backdrops are when you're actually in-game and playing as Cloud, it doesn't stand out quite as much. So its reimagining in Rebirth as a prominent feature really sort of dials up some of these more discrete aspects of the original background. So overall, I think Kalm lends itself to the original game in terms of features. So for example, the clock tower's there just as it is in the original, the fortified wall is there just as it is in the original, but overall it's been amplified and really sort of emphasised, I suppose, in the modern version of the game. And I think although it's not necessarily an aesthetic thing, one of the main things that I really enjoyed about the modern Kalm was that it retained almost verbatim the music ahead on our way, which, as I say, it really emphasises that relaxed, whimsical first town feeling of the game. And although, of course, the soundtrack has been modernised, it really is consistent with what we had in the original. Turning now to the Grasslands, it can't be understated just how important this environment is to the game. It establishes the scale and the scope of the world. It is indeed our introduction to the world in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And it establishes the array of interaction and exploration and all of this stuff that was so speculated upon in the build-up to the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's release. However, what it also does is it crafts a sense of the world we are inhabiting. It's very world-building and lore-focused as well. And so, where the original was simply a basic swath of green, with only the theme music hinting at this dystopian environment that was impacted by Shinra, in Rebirth we have a comparatively bright and breezy terrain that is nonetheless pockmarked with industrial decay, Mako piping, abandoned dwellings, and traces of a living history that hints at everything from archaic deities to shifting nations and civilizations, and of course the impact of Shinra. So overall, the Grasslands, like Midgar before it in Remake, is much lighter and brighter and optimistic compared to its source material, and actually what I had initially expected, but it does retain some important consistencies in terms of layout, if not, of course, its dimensions and scale, and we have key features such as the swamp, the chocobo farm, and bits like that follow the original pretty closely, all things considered. Moving on through the mithril mines, which have likewise been embellished and amplified compared to the original, we come out the other side in the Junon region, and this is where some of the real overt changes and additions have been made to the topography of Gaia, since rather than a continuation of the Grasslands, which is what we have in the original, I mean everything's sort of just like a green landmass in the original game, we have instead a wasteland of shipwrecks and industrial containers that span the shoreline of the region, and geographically speaking we have a pretty big departure from the original game, with the formerly accessible location of Fort Condor being partitioned off to an inaccessible island, and the features of that, where we have the minigame and so on in the original, have been repackaged into a separate minigame elsewhere on the map. So these changes, they may seem weird to some. Personally, kind of thinking about it, I can see the reasoning behind wanting to remove Fort Condor, because really it is quite a derivative side quest as it was, and I think when we first encounter it, it is optional until we get to the huge materia arc that takes place later. So I think it would have been a huge task to sort of build out that location and everything that's involved there, with comparatively little payoff in terms of the main story and the momentum that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was going for. And regarding the shipwrecks around Junon and all of this new stuff, I actually really loved that, and how it builds out the lore and the setting of the game, and the history, I suppose, since once we arrive at Lower Junon, we learn about why that stuff is there. We learn about the pre-Shinra Republic of Junon, and how it was a seafaring port city, and all of this sort of stuff. So really nice world building, and how the setting goes hand in hand with the lore there. Coming into Lower Junon and Junon proper now, the former stays relatively consistent with the original game. I don't think there's too much to sort of expand on there. Even the layout's pretty consistent. But of course it has been embellished in all the ways that we might expect of a fully explorable 3D environment. However, turning to Junon proper now, or Upper Junon, it was actually pretty interesting how this was redesigned and reimagined, because in the original game we have something that is very much positioned as like a military base, a sort of militarized city. That seems the primary purpose of it, and it has this cold, utilitarian, dystopian feel about it that is geared very much towards the Shinra war machine and all of that sort of thing. It has a sort of sci-fi Blade Runner-esque feel to it that Final Fantasy VII introduced in various settings, particularly Junon and Midgar. However, in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we have the city in very much two halves, I think, two aesthetic halves, because we have the military installation and the military presence there. But then strangely, we have this polished seafront, sort of gentrified looking quarter with a huge shopping mall that seems like a touristic destination and all of this sort of thing that's parked behind the sister ray. And I suppose thinking about it, this makes sense in a lot of ways, since Junon is the jumping off point and the port that leads the denizens of that continent over to the Costa del Sol. So it makes sense that, there'd be this sort of touristic and leisurely element to it. But I suppose that in and of itself is another departure from the original game, because the container ship that takes us over to Costa del Sol in the original, it's very much a military craft. And then in this game, it's like a pleasure cruise ship. So, yeah, I think they've brightened up Junon a lot more, made it a much more sort of optimistic, sort of enjoyable environment, whereas in the former, it's sort of more cold and military focused. Coming now into the Carell region, we have Costa del Sol, we have Carell proper, and we have the Gold Saucer. And overall, these locations, again, were pretty faithful to the source material and the renderings that we have in those pre-rendered backdrops. And I think particularly with regards to the Gold Saucer, it was interesting how they were going to approach this. And I was pleased to see that they have made it a much more cohesive and realistic looking experience compared to the original title, where characters were expected to sort of jump around into tunnels to get around the park and stuff like that. So personally, I really liked where they went with the Gold Saucer. Much more relatable, plausible and realistic, but it still engages and has that immersive break from the action, I suppose, with this surrounding doom and gloom that is very much Final Fantasy VII's world. I also really liked how they brought both Carell and Costa del Sol to life, based on the source material. As I say, they're both pretty faithful, and like Kalm before them, I think these areas are just comprised of one or two pre-rendered paintings in the original game. So looking at that source material and then building out the way they did, I think that was really good. And overall, the only jarring aspect, I think, of the Corel region compared to the original, for me at least, relates back to the overworld and this sense of scale, which a lot of people have discussed. I do feel that the world being shrunk down, as it has been in Rebirth, it really jars. It removes that impression of these endless, barren Badlands, and this sense of distance between areas, particularly the Gold Saucer, that did have this sort of ominous expanse of nothing around it, and it was quite an ominous area. So yeah, they've sort of removed that, and actually the Badlands around Gold Saucer are explorable, and they're comparatively compact and dense with stuff. Coming on to Gongaga and Cosmo Canyon, I think these were among the most criticised locations by players to date that I've seen, regarding most specifically their surrounding overworld environments. And I'm somewhat on the fence with this. Firstly, regarding the maze-like topography of Gongaga, it's obviously intended as a puzzle-like region. And I would say that muddling the conventions of a dungeon, which is obviously meant to be puzzling, it's meant to be challenging, with an overworld, which is meant to be traversable more than anything else, that's obviously a weird and somewhat frustrating juxtaposition to sort of bring together. And the two principles of those things, like overworlds and dungeons, they're completely opposite, so kind of bringing them together is quite strange. And there's also the argument that it was unnecessarily jarring for the story momentum. And I would agree with that criticism. I think doing things to sort of purposefully obstruct story when like the flow and the momentum of a story when it doesn't need to be obstructed is stressful. But conversely, it is a unique and thoroughly explorable region. So I did overall like Gongaga as a region to explore, but I enjoyed it a lot more on subsequent visits rather than when I was trying to progress the story on the first run through and my first time sort of venturing through it. In terms of Gongaga's relationship to its source material, I think where other locations have shrunk down, as we were just talking about the Badlands, for example, in Carell, Gongaga has actually expanded exponentially compared to the source material, which again was only one sort of pre-rendered panel. So it's become this huge, dense forest and jungle compared to the original title. And I think the Gongagan people and the village itself within that They have become actually a little more optimistic and whimsical. It has a sort of first town vibe to it, rather than the original, which had this damaged and decayed rendering of the place. It was much more doom and gloom. They were much more down and out because of all the people that had died in the reactor explosion and stuff like that. So yeah, it was interesting to see where they went with Gongaga. They were much more sort of hopeful, optimistic sort of people, and as such the environment reflects that. Coming to Cosmo Canyon, again there were some complaints about the accompanying overworld there, which again I didn't really mind it personally. I don't know why, but I was surprised to see cacti among the flora and fauna there, although the Cosmo Canyon, or the Cosmo region, has always had that red rock mountainous feel to it that visually reminds me of places like Monument Valley or Utah or whatever in the real world. It just seemed weird to me to see any sort of plants there at all, really, but I don't know why that's an observation. Coming to the settlement itself, I thought it was visually fantastic. It was very faithful to the original in how it was very primitive looking, but nonetheless had these hints of technology and these hints of advancement around it. I've always liked how they had that balance in Cosmo Canyon, maintaining that thread of the cyberpunk coming through the entire game. But what I think most surprised me was how it was positioned and posited much more as a touristic destination, and most of the NPCs there seem to be these sort of gentrified hippies rather than studious astronomers and natives or anything else like that. And this is hinted at in the original game. They do mention that it's a very visited destination for people wanting to study the planet, but the Cosmo Canyon of Rebirth really lends itself into this sort of tourist trap sort of vibe, and you never know, this may actually be a response to what's actually happening in Japan at the moment, because sort of post-COVID, it's all over the news. There's like an insane amount of tourism going on there. It's completely saturated, and there's a lot of people in Japan trying to take advantage of that and enjoy that, because of course they've had a stagnant economy for like decades, but there are those who are trying to stop it and saying they're ruining everything. So who knows? I think I just found that aspect of Cosmo Canyon quite interesting as a location in this new game. Coming finally now to Nibelheim and the Temple of the Ancients. Regarding Nibelheim, it was surprisingly faithful to the original game again, and perhaps of all of the locations, apart from Lower Junon as well, it had the least amount added on or adapted, since it's very much still this sort of circular town. Everything's facing this central well, quite a basic layout there, and if anything they made it more reductive compared to the original game, because if we account for the fact that the Shinra mansion has been reduced down to basically just a hallway and a basement, rather than this fully explorable environment like in 1997. There's an argument that it has been sort of reduced down there. And I think probably the biggest change comes in the contemporary Nibelheim, because the denizens of the town there and the role they play is very different compared to the original. So Shinra is actively stationed at the town, and there's no imposters pretending that Nibelheim, the disaster never happened and stuff like that. So it is quite a change. But again, like Cosmo Canyon, it's more about the NPCs changing the vibe of that environment rather than the geography and the sort of actual layout and architecture of the town, which, as I say, was pretty faithful. More broadly, looking to the Nibel region, very Nordic, I think, Scandinavian inspired perhaps, and one of my favourite locations to explore in the game. Just overall, really enjoyed the aesthetic and the music there. Turning finally now to the Temple of the Ancients. I'm going to ignore the City of the Ancients because I don't think we quite see enough of it, but regarding the temple, radical departure in form, function, and even location compared to the original game, with it kind of conflating with Bone Village, City of the Ancients, and that sort of location in the northern continent in Rebirth. And so alongside Fort Condor, I think it was definitely the biggest sort of topographical change that we see in this setting. And such is the difference of location and actually the features of the place. I don't think there's any real way to directly compare the two. I mean, they're both very puzzle-heavy dungeons, and they both have these Escher-style gravity-defying staircases and exploration points and stuff. But that said, I really like both of them. they both create a sense of the ancient, and I suppose this sort of primitive but sort of advanced sort of civilization. I suppose we could relate it to like the pyramids in Egypt and that sort of thing, you know, sort of primitive but still pretty advanced for the time, and quite not occultish but esoteric and unknown to the current world that we're living in. And I just think the sort of flow of them were quite similar, even though the features of them were completely different. The flow, that sort of build, an anticipated build to a narrative payoff, worked really well in both versions of Temple of the Ancients. So I did like that location. I don't know how other people felt. I mean, I've seen most people praising it. I'm sure there is some criticism towards it, but I thought it was pretty good despite the radical changes of it. And there we have it. That is quite a high-level comparison there, but I really wanted to sort of just cover in brief the reimagined locations in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, look at how they depart, and look at how these changes play out in terms of our experience of the setting. Overall, I really enjoyed how they brought to life, really doubled down and emphasised the sense of living space, the sense of history and the sense of lore in the locations. And barring a few exceptions that were more around the surrounding geography and the overworld and how that was utilised and contracted in size, those were my kind of main criticisms. And I'm perfectly amenable to modern Final Fantasy games and them exploring different ways to design these games, but I just have always unreservedly subscribed to the idea that the illusion of scope in designing overworlds, whether that's through the slight minifying of characters and locations, whatever, I think that is the best way to create a sense of expanse without spending forever traversing it, like you would in like an Elder Scrolls, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily an outmoded game design style. I don't think it's unachievable, but that's my take on it. And other than that, fantastic set of locations that Rebirth showcased here